Hey guys, tonight we begin with a very simple idea, a medieval princess. You might imagine a young woman in a beautiful gown, sitting beside a castle window, perhaps brushing her hair while birds gather politely outside. There might be a horse, there might be roses, there might even be a handsome prince somewhere in the distance, preferably wearing an unreasonable amount of velvet. And then, eventually there would be a wedding, the musicians would play, everyone would smile, and they would all live happily ever after. Well, not quite. So, tonight, dim the lights a little. Put your phone somewhere slightly out of reach. If you can manage that remarkable act of self-control and settle into something comfortable, because we're going to spend a long, quiet evening with the medieval princess. Not the fairy tale version. The real one. The girl who was born into a powerful family, raised in a world where her surname mattered enormously, and then discovered that her future could be discussed by several grown men while she was sitting quietly in another room. Being a princess in the Middle Ages could certainly be luxurious. There could be silk, there could be jewels, there could be servants, there could be enormous meals where someone brought you an entire roasted animal and apparently considered that a reasonable portion. But there was another side to it. A princess was valuable. And being valuable was not always the same thing as being free. For many medieval royal daughters, marriage was not primarily about romance. It was diplomacy. It was inheritance. It was territory. It was military strategy. It was a way to settle disputes without fighting. And occasionally, because apparently medieval politics needed even more complications, it was a way of connecting two families who already shared so many ancestors that the family tree was beginning to resemble a hedge. So let's settle down and slowly enter that world. Imagine a royal court somewhere in medieval Europe. The exact kingdom doesn't matter yet. Perhaps England, perhaps France, perhaps one of the many smaller kingdoms and principalities that existed between them. The castle is quiet at night. The stone walls are cold. Torches flicker along the corridors. Somewhere, servants are still working. Someone is carrying firewood. Someone is preparing food for the next morning. Someone is probably arguing about a horse. And upstairs, a princess is sleeping. She may be 6 years old. She may be 8. She may be 12. She might not yet understand what the adults around her are discussing. But her future may already have been decided. This was one of the strangest parts of medieval royal life. A princess did not necessarily have to reach adulthood before her marriage became a political matter. Betrothals could happen when children were very young. The actual wedding might take place years later, when both parties were old enough according to the rules of the church. But the agreement could come first. And once an agreement had been made, it could become enormously important. A princess might be promised to the son of another king, or to a duke, or to a powerful nobleman. Sometimes a man was considerably older. Sometimes he was close to her age. Sometimes the arrangement made perfect political sense. And sometimes it was one of those situations where you look at the family tree and quietly wonder whether anyone involved had considered simply making friends instead. The point was that royal marriage was business. Very important business. A medieval king had land. He had titles. He had claims. He had enemies. He had allies. And he had daughters. Those daughters could become diplomatic bridges. A marriage could bring two territories together. It could strengthen an alliance. It could create a claim to a throne. It could produce children who would later inherit enormous amounts of land. And because medieval inheritance could be complicated enough to make a modern tax form look relaxing, every marriage had consequences. This meant that a princess's childhood could be surprisingly political. She still had toys. She still had friends. She could still laugh. She could still complain about food. She could still become attached to particular servants. She could still have the ordinary emotions of a young person. But around her, adults were thinking about something else. Her future, and more specifically, who her future husband should be. One of the most famous examples is Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was born in 1122 into one of the wealthiest and most powerful noble families in Western Europe. Her father was William X, Duke of Aquitaine. Aquitaine was enormous. It was not simply a pleasant little patch of countryside with a vineyard and a decorative castle. It covered a huge portion of what is now southwestern France, and Eleanor inherited it. That alone made her extremely important. She was not merely a princess because her father happened to be a duke. She was a major political heiress, and that meant that the moment she became an heir, her marriage became everybody's business. Of course it did. If you control one of the richest territories in Europe, people were going to have opinions about whom you married. Eleanor's father died in 1137. She was still very young, and suddenly, she was one of the most desirable marriage prospects in Europe. She married Louis VII of France. The marriage connected her vast inheritance to the French royal family. On paper, this looked sensible. Louis was the heir to the French throne. Eleanor controlled Aquitaine. Together, they represented an impressive combination of power. But medieval marriage had a habit of being much more complicated once actual human beings entered the room. Louis and Eleanor were very different people. Louis was deeply religious. Eleanor was politically ambitious, intelligent, and accustomed to the culture of Aquitaine, which had its own traditions and aristocratic world. Their marriage produced 2 daughters, but no son, and that mattered a great deal. Medieval royal couples did not simply have children because they wanted a family. Their children could determine the future of kingdoms. A son could inherit. A daughter could marry into another dynasty. A child could secure succession. Or, if there were no suitable children, a succession crisis could begin. So every royal pregnancy carried a little more political weight than most modern families would probably find relaxing. Eleanor and Louis eventually separated. Their marriage was annulled in 1152, and here the story becomes particularly interesting. Eleanor was still Eleanor. She still possessed Aquitaine. She had not become less politically valuable simply because her first marriage ended. Instead, she married Henry, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. Henry was 11 years younger than Eleanor, and in 1154, he became King Henry II of England. So Eleanor went from being married to the King of France to being married to the King of England. Not bad for someone whose first marriage had supposedly failed. She became Queen of England, and her territories, combined with Henry's possessions, formed one of the most powerful political combinations in Western Europe. Their relationship was complicated, very complicated. Henry was energetic, ambitious, and constantly moving around his territories. Eleanor had her own political influence. They had several children. Among them were Richard, who would become Richard the Lionheart, and John, who would later become King John. Yes, that John, the one from the Robin Hood stories. Though medieval history is rarely quite as neat as the stories make it seem, Eleanor's life shows us something important. The medieval princess was not always powerless. Some women became extraordinarily powerful. They could own property. They could inherit lands. They could act as regents. They could negotiate. They could manage estates. They could patronize churches and monasteries. They could influence their husbands and sons. Some even ruled territories directly, but power did not necessarily mean freedom. A princess might possess enormous wealth while still having little control over the most personal decision of her life, marriage. And that is where the fairy tale begins to quietly disappear. Let's imagine another princess. She is perhaps 10 years old. She has been told that she is going to marry someone. Maybe she has never met him. Maybe she has seen him once. Maybe she has heard that he is kind, or brave, or handsome, or more likely, that his family owns several useful castles. Nobody says it quite so bluntly. People talk about honor. They talk about alliance. They talk about peace. They talk about the happiness of both families. But beneath all those polite phrases is a very practical calculation. Who gets what? What lands come with the marriage? What dowry will be provided? What inheritance will the bride bring? What will the groom promise her? What happens if the marriage produces no children? What happens if the husband dies? What happens if the wife dies? What happens if one family changes sides? And what happens if everyone suddenly decides that the agreement was a terrible idea? Because medieval diplomacy was not exactly known for its stability, treaties could collapse, alliances could change, kings could die, nobles could rebel, and marriages could become political disasters. A princess might therefore grow up understanding that her body and her future were connected to something much larger than herself. Her marriage could change borders. Her children could inherit kingdoms. Her husband's enemies could become her enemies. Her husband's family could become her new family. And sometimes, that new family was not particularly interested in welcoming her. The romantic image of the medieval wedding is also misleading. There could certainly be beautiful ceremonies. There could be music. There could be elaborate clothing. There could be feasting. But the marriage itself was a legal and political institution. The church played an enormous role. There were rules about who could marry whom. Kinship mattered. And this was particularly inconvenient for European royalty because royal families had a tendency to marry other royal families. Again, and again, and again, after enough generations, everyone was related. The church technically prohibited marriages within certain degrees of kinship, but dispensations could be obtained. And medieval genealogies could become remarkably creative when political necessity arrived. If a marriage was politically useful enough, someone could usually find a reason to make it acceptable, or at least acceptable after several documents, negotiations, and ecclesiastical approvals. This is one reason medieval dynasties could become so interconnected. A princess might marry a man whose mother was related to her. Then their children might marry into another family. Then their grandchildren might marry someone connected to the first family. And eventually, the entire European aristocracy could look like a particularly complicated family reunion where nobody remembers why they are related, but everyone is apparently entitled to a throne. Of course, genetics was not understood in the modern sense. Medieval people did not know about recessive genes. They did not understand genetic disorders the way we do, but they did understand family resemblance. They knew that certain characteristics appeared repeatedly in particular families. They knew that children resembled their parents. They knew that royal blood mattered socially and politically, and they were very concerned about lineage. Bloodlines were not simply biological. They were political. A person's ancestry could determine whether they had a legitimate claim to a title. It could determine whether they were accepted as an heir. It could determine whether a marriage was considered suitable. So a princess's family tree could be more important than her personality. That sounds cold, and it was, but it was also normal within the political system of the time. A medieval royal daughter was raised to understand her position. She might learn religion. She might learn music. She might learn languages. She might learn embroidery. She might learn household management. And if she belonged to a particularly important court, she might also learn diplomacy and politics. She would need to know how to behave around powerful people. She would need to understand ceremony. She would need to know which noble woman deserved respect. She would need to know how to receive visitors. She would need to know how to present herself. And she might eventually be expected to run a large household. This last part is easy to underestimate. A royal household was not just a family sitting around a table. It could include dozens or hundreds of people, servants, clerks, chaplains, cooks, musicians, ladies-in-waiting, messengers, guards, officials, and many others. Managing such a household required organization. A queen or princess could have significant responsibilities. So while modern imagination sometimes reduces medieval noble women to decorative figures sitting in towers, the reality could be much more active. A royal woman might oversee estates. She might issue instructions. She might correspond with officials. She might supervise household accounts. She might manage servants. And during her husband's absence, she could sometimes exercise real political authority. That was especially important because kings were frequently absent. A medieval king could spend months traveling. He might be fighting a war. He might be visiting another territory. He might be attending a diplomatic meeting. He might simply be moving around his possessions because ruling a medieval kingdom from one permanent office was not really an option. There was no email. There was no telephone. There was no group chat where someone could write, "The rebellion has started." Thoughts. If you wanted information, you needed a messenger. And if you wanted to govern a distant region, you had to send people there. So royal women sometimes became the practical managers of the kingdom while the king was away. This could give them considerable influence, but it could also create enormous pressure, because if something went wrong, everyone noticed. A medieval princess was therefore living inside a strange contradiction. She could be surrounded by luxury. She could have beautiful clothes. She could sleep in a decorated chamber. She could eat expensive food. She could have servants attending her. And yet she could have very little control over where she would live next year. Her husband might be chosen for her. Her marriage might be arranged for political reasons. Her children might be expected to inherit specific territories. Her movements might be carefully watched. Her friendships might matter politically. Even her letters could have consequences. And then there was childbirth. We can move gently into this subject because it was one of the central realities of medieval royal women's lives. A princess who became a wife was often expected to become a mother. Quickly, the purpose of many dynastic marriages was to produce legitimate heirs. The pressure could be immense. If a marriage produced children, especially sons, it could be considered successful. If it did not, the relationship could become politically unstable. And if a queen gave birth to several daughters but no sons, people could become increasingly anxious. Of course, daughters were politically useful too, but medieval succession systems often favored men. That varied by region and dynasty. Still, the preference for male heirs was widespread. So a royal woman's pregnancies were matters of state. People waited for news. Courts celebrated births. Churches might hold ceremonies. Letters were sent. Gifts were exchanged. And if a child died, the political consequences could be enormous. But beneath the politics was a human being. A woman experiencing pregnancy. A woman giving birth. A woman losing children. A woman raising children who might one day become kings. This is one of the quiet tragedies of medieval royal life. The historical records often tell us the political consequences. They tell us who inherited what. They tell us which treaty was signed. They tell us which child became king. But they often say much less about how the mother felt. And that silence can be striking, because these women were not symbols. They were people. They worried. They became lonely. They became attached to their children. They argued with their husbands. They became homesick. They got sick. They grew old. And they sometimes found themselves trapped inside marriages that had been arranged before they were old enough to understand what marriage meant. So tonight, as we continue floating through the medieval world, it is worth remembering that the princess in the castle was not waiting for a prince to rescue her. She was usually waiting for the next instruction. Perhaps a letter had arrived. Perhaps her father had chosen a husband. Perhaps preparations were being made for a journey. Perhaps she was being taught the customs of a court she had never seen. And perhaps she was quietly wondering what the strange man she was supposed to marry would actually be like. Because somewhere beyond the castle walls, another family was preparing for her arrival, and she was about to leave everything familiar behind. Let's float over to another royal disaster. Because medieval princesses did not simply marry. They moved, and sometimes they moved very far. A princess from England might be sent to France. A French princess might travel into Iberia. A daughter of a German dynasty might be sent into Italy. A Byzantine princess might marry into a Western European ruling house. And once she left home, she could find herself in a court where the language was different. The food was different. The customs were different. The climate was different. The religion might be practiced somewhat differently. And almost nobody cared that she missed her childhood bedroom. Her job was to adapt. That was the bargain. She carried her family's identity with her. Her marriage connected two worlds. And if she succeeded, she could become an important political figure. If she struggled, well, medieval courts had plenty of other things to gossip about. So perhaps tonight, as you settle deeper into the darkness, imagine that journey. A young princess leaving her childhood home. A long road ahead. Horses moving slowly. Servants carrying trunks. Guards riding nearby. Perhaps a priest traveling with the group. Perhaps relatives accompanying her for part of the journey. And behind her, a castle that had been home for most of her life. Ahead was another castle. Another family. Another language. Another bed. Another life. And somewhere in all of this, perhaps a marriage ceremony. Not the end of a fairy tale. Just the beginning of a very complicated political arrangement. And for the medieval princess, there was still much more waiting beyond the wedding. Because once she became a wife, she had to become something else as well. A queen, a mother, a political intermediary, a manager, a symbol. And sometimes when the men around her were busy fighting over who should rule what, she became the person quietly keeping everything together, which is probably a good place for us to rest for a moment. The castle is quiet now. The torches are burning low. The servants have mostly gone to sleep. The princess is somewhere behind those thick stone walls. Tomorrow there will be letters. There will be meetings. There will be decisions. There will be another conversation about marriage. Of course there will. But tonight, for a few peaceful hours, none of that matters. She can sleep, and so can you, because the medieval world will still be there in the morning. And unfortunately for everyone involved, the family tree will probably be even more complicated. Hey guys, tonight we continue our slow journey through the life of the medieval princess. Last time, we left her standing somewhere between two worlds. Behind her was the castle where she had grown up. Ahead was a new court, a new husband, a new family, and quite possibly new language. Because apparently being born into royalty was not enough work already. You also had to pack your entire childhood into a few chests and travel hundreds of miles to marry someone you might barely know. So let's settle back in. Let the lights stay low. Let the room stay quiet. And imagine the road beneath the wheels of a slow medieval carriage. There is no airplane waiting at the end. There is no comfortable hotel. There is no quick journey. There is simply the road. And somewhere along it, a young princess is slowly becoming a stranger in her own life. When a medieval royal bride traveled to her future husband's court, the journey itself could take weeks or even months. The exact experience depended on where she came from and where she was going. Some journeys were relatively comfortable. Others were exhausting. Roads could be rough. Rivers had to be crossed. Weather could change. Horses needed to rest. Food had to be carried. And every night, the traveling household had to find somewhere to sleep. The princess rarely traveled alone. She might have ladies accompanying her. Servants, clerics, guards, messengers, officials, sometimes members of her own family. And among all these people were individuals who might remain with her for years. These attendants were important. They could become her closest friends. They might speak her language. They might know the customs of her childhood court. And when she eventually reached her husband's country, those familiar faces could become one of the few pieces of home she had left. Because the moment she crossed into another political world, everything could feel unfamiliar. Imagine growing up in a castle where everyone speaks your language. You know which hallway leads to the chapel. You know which servant brings breakfast. You know which garden is yours. You know which priest is kind. You know which noblewoman is always gossiping. You know where your mother keeps the good fabric. And then suddenly, you're somewhere else. The architecture looks different. The people speak differently. Their manners are different. Even the way they eat may seem strange. And you're expected to behave as though this is perfectly normal. Because you are a princess. You have a role. And roles do not usually care whether you're homesick. One of the great misunderstandings about medieval royal women is that they simply moved into a castle and became part of the household. In reality, they could bring an entire household of their own. This was practical. It helped preserve their cultural identity. It also allowed the bride to maintain trusted servants. A queen needed people she could rely on. She needed scribes, ladies, chaplains, officials, and sometimes translators. The household could become a little island of familiarity inside an unfamiliar court, and that mattered because the new husband was not necessarily going to be her best friend. In fact, there was no guarantee that they would even like each other. This sounds obvious today, but medieval marriage did not begin with the assumption that emotional compatibility was the most important thing. The important question was whether the marriage worked politically, and political success could be measured in very practical ways. Did the alliance hold? Did the bride's inheritance arrive? Did the couple produce children? Did the marriage strengthen the dynasty? Did it help prevent conflict? Did it create new claims? These were the things people cared about. Romance was optional, very optional. Sometimes affection developed. Sometimes it did not. Sometimes a couple became genuinely close. Sometimes they simply performed the expected duties of husband and wife. And sometimes the marriage became deeply unhappy. But the princess was still expected to perform. She had to appear graceful. She had to participate in ceremonies. She had to show respect to her husband's relatives. She had to build relationships with powerful people. And she had to learn very quickly. Because royal courts were complicated places. A medieval court was not simply a large family living together. It was a political environment. Every person had a rank. Every interaction could carry meaning. Who sat beside whom? Who entered the room first? Who received a gift? Who was invited to dinner? Who stood near the queen? Who was allowed to speak? These things mattered. The princess had entered a world where etiquette could become politics. And sometimes politics could become personal. A queen might have disagreements with her mother-in-law. She might have conflicts with her husband's siblings. She might find herself competing with another woman at court. She might have supporters. She might have enemies. She might even have people who smiled warmly while quietly sending letters against her, because humans have remained remarkably consistent over the centuries. We invented castles. We invented elaborate titles. We invented heraldry. But we apparently never managed to eliminate gossip. If anything, medieval aristocrats were extremely committed to it. Still, a princess had advantages. Her position gave her access. She could speak to people others could not. She might influence her husband. She might communicate with her father or brothers. She could sometimes act as a diplomatic intermediary. And if she was intelligent and politically capable, she could become extremely influential. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine again. Her life demonstrates just how much power a medieval woman could eventually accumulate. She was not simply someone's wife. She remained connected to Aquitaine. She maintained her own political interests. She became queen of 2 different kingdoms. And she was the mother of several children who would shape European history. Her son Richard became King of England. Her son John became king after him. And her daughters were married into other powerful dynasties. Her children were political pieces on a gigantic European board. But Eleanor herself was also a player. That distinction matters. Many royal women were used in political arrangements. But some learned how to use those arrangements themselves. They understood the system. They knew how to negotiate. They knew whom to trust. And they knew that influence did not always require sitting on a throne. Sometimes influence meant having the king listen to you. Sometimes it meant controlling access to the king. Sometimes it meant managing land. Sometimes it meant supporting a particular son. And sometimes it meant simply surviving long enough to become the senior woman in the family. Age could bring authority. A young princess might have little influence. A queen with children could have more. A queen mother could have even more. And a dowager queen, especially one with property and connections, could sometimes become a formidable political figure. But before any of that happened, She had to survive the basic realities of medieval life. And one of those realities was pregnancy. For a royal woman, pregnancy was not merely a private family event. Everyone cared. Her husband cared. Her parents cared. Her husband's parents cared. The nobility cared. The church cared. The kingdom cared. And if the king was particularly anxious about succession, he probably cared a great deal. Imagine trying to rest during pregnancy while an entire political establishment is waiting for your child. Not exactly the peaceful environment recommended by modern parenting books. A royal pregnancy could become a public event. When the queen gave birth, news might travel rapidly through the court. The birth of a son could be celebrated. A daughter could also be welcomed, particularly if the dynasty valued marriage alliances. But a son was often preferred because male inheritance was generally favored in many European kingdoms. This created enormous pressure, and it did not stop after one child. If the first child was a daughter, another pregnancy might follow, and another, and another. Royal women could have many pregnancies over the course of their lives. Some children survived, some did not. Infant and child mortality was high. This was true across medieval society. But for royal families, the political consequences were magnified. A dead heir was not simply a family tragedy. It could become a succession problem. A queen might lose a child and then immediately be expected to think about the next pregnancy. The historical records can be remarkably cold about this. A chronicler may write that a child was born, then another, then one died, and then the story moves on. But behind that sentence was a mother, and she may have been grieving. We rarely get the full emotional story. That is one of the frustrating things about studying medieval women. The records were often written by men, and they were usually interested in politics, religion, property, warfare, and succession. They were not necessarily interested in what a princess thought while sitting alone at night. So we have to be careful. We cannot invent emotions, but we can recognize the human reality behind the records. These women were living through things that were physically and emotionally demanding. They could become sick. They could lose children. They could lose husbands. They could lose parents. And they could become widows while still quite young. Widowhood was another strange stage of royal women's lives. A widow could be vulnerable, but she could also become surprisingly powerful. If she had property, money, or children with claims to titles, she could become politically important. Some widows returned to their families. Some remained at court. Some entered religious houses. Some remarried. Some chose not to remarry. And some became active political figures. The possibilities varied greatly, but widowhood could change the balance of power. A young wife might have been expected to obey her husband. A widow could sometimes control her own property. She might become guardian of her children. She could negotiate. She could manage estates. And if her son was a minor king, she might even become regent. That meant governing in his name. Imagine that transition. Yesterday, you were simply the king's wife. Today, your husband is dead. Your son is too young to rule. And suddenly, people are waiting for you to make decisions. That happened, not constantly, but often enough to matter. One example is Blanche of Castile. Blanche was born in 1188. She was the daughter of Alfonso VIII of Castile and Eleanor of England. Yes, Eleanor of England was herself the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. The family tree continues doing its usual medieval gymnastics. Blanche married Louis VIII of France. She became queen consort, but Louis died in 1226. Their son, Louis IX, was only 12 years old, so Blanche became regent. She effectively governed France during her son's minority, and this was not merely a ceremonial role. She had to deal with rebellious nobles. She had to defend her son's position. She had to manage politics. She had to make alliances. And she had to ensure that the monarchy survived until her son was old enough to rule. Blanche was deeply religious. She was also politically capable. She managed a difficult political situation with considerable skill, and her son eventually became one of the most famous kings of medieval France. Louis IX, later known as St. Louis. So here we have a medieval queen who had been brought into France through marriage and eventually became one of the central political figures in the kingdom. This is why it is important not to describe medieval princesses as simply powerless. The system was restrictive, but within that system, women could find spaces of authority. Sometimes those spaces were created by inheritance, sometimes by widowhood, sometimes by motherhood, sometimes by personality, and sometimes simply because the men who were supposed to be ruling were absent, which, in medieval Europe, happened quite often. Kings traveled, kings went on crusades, kings went to war, kings visited distant territories, kings were imprisoned, kings became sick, kings died. So someone had to keep things functioning, and that someone could be the queen. Let's float over to the less glamorous side of royal life. Food. Yes, even princesses had to eat. And medieval food was not quite the endless banquet of modern movies. There could be elaborate feasts, but everyday food depended on wealth, season, location, and circumstance. A wealthy princess could have access to meat, fish, bread, cheese, fruit, spices, and wine. Spices were especially valuable. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, saffron. These could be expensive imports. Using them was a way to demonstrate wealth. A royal household could spend considerable money on food, but eating was not always comfortable. There were no refrigerators. Food preservation was difficult. Meat could be salted, smoked, dried, or otherwise preserved. Fresh food depended on season and location. And then there was sanitation. Let's not linger too long on that. We're trying to sleep. The medieval castle was not necessarily filthy. People had systems for waste. But modern standards of sanitation simply did not exist. Water quality could vary. Diseases were common. Medical knowledge was limited. A princess could have access to better doctors than ordinary people. But that did not mean doctors could cure everything. They could bleed her. They could prescribe herbs. They could recommend diets. They could perform various treatments. And sometimes they were helpful. Sometimes they were not. Medicine was a mixture of observation, inherited knowledge, religious belief, classical texts, and practices that modern medicine would politely decline. A royal woman therefore lived with risks that wealth could reduce but never eliminate. Childbirth was dangerous. Infection was dangerous. Illness was dangerous. And even a simple fever could become serious. This makes the image of the glamorous medieval princess slightly different. Yes, she might wear silk, but she might also spend several days feeling terribly unwell while physicians debated which herb to put into her drink. Not exactly the spa experience. Clothing itself was another important part of royal identity. A princess's clothes communicated status. Fabric mattered. Color mattered. Fur mattered. Jewelry mattered. The quality of embroidery mattered. And sumptuary laws sometimes attempted to regulate who could wear particular fabrics or ornaments. A princess could therefore be visually identified as someone important. Her clothing was part of the political language of the court. She was not simply dressing nicely. She was displaying rank. And this mattered especially during ceremonies. A coronation, a wedding, a religious feast, a diplomatic reception, a royal procession. Every public appearance had meaning. A princess might be expected to stand beside her husband. She might receive gifts. She might be presented to foreign ambassadors. She might participate in religious ceremonies. And she had to know exactly how to behave. The wrong gesture could be interpreted as disrespect. The wrong seating arrangement could cause offense. The wrong marriage alliance could create a political crisis. And the wrong heir could eventually create a civil war. So perhaps it is understandable that medieval royal women sometimes looked serious in portraits. Although, to be fair, medieval portraits are not exactly famous for their cheerful vacation photography. Most people look like they have just been informed that someone misplaced an important manuscript. But there was another side to court life: entertainment, music, poetry, hunting, games, storytelling, religious festivals, dancing, A princess could have moments of genuine enjoyment. Medieval people were not constantly miserable. This is important. The Middle Ages were not one long dark room where everyone sighed dramatically. People laughed. They celebrated. They fell in love. They ate good food. They listened to music. They told stories. Children played. Nobles hunted. Courts held festivals. Church calendars provided regular celebrations. A princess could have friendships and pleasures. She could enjoy books. She could enjoy music. She might become a patron of artists or religious institutions. She might love particular animals. She might enjoy gardens. She might become interested in religious devotion, and she could certainly have opinions. Strong ones, especially about her husband. Of course she could. One of the most interesting things about medieval royal marriages is how often couples lived apart. The king might be away for months. The queen might remain in another city. They communicated through letters and messengers. This meant that a royal marriage could be emotionally strange. You might be married to someone who was physically absent for much of the year. You might have children together. You might share political interests. But you could spend long periods separated. Sometimes that separation was practical, sometimes political, sometimes personal, and sometimes the king simply preferred another court or another woman. Royal infidelity was hardly rare. Kings had mistresses. Queens could have close relationships too, although female adultery was often judged much more harshly. The double standard was alive and well. It had apparently decided to become a permanent feature of human history. But these relationships could have political consequences. A king's mistress could become influential. Her children might receive gifts or titles. The queen could become jealous. Court factions could form, and suddenly a personal relationship was no longer personal. It became politics. This is another reason being a medieval princess was not a fairy tale. Every part of life could become political. Marriage, children, clothing, friendships, travel, religion, property, even where you sat at dinner. Yet despite all these restrictions, some women became remarkably skilled at navigating the system. They learned patience. They learned diplomacy. They learned when to speak. And perhaps most importantly, they learned when not to speak. A princess did not always need to dominate a room. Sometimes she only needed to influence the person who did. That could be enough. So as we leave the second stretch of our journey, imagine the young bride again. She has arrived. The ceremony has happened. The guests have gone. The music has stopped. The candles are burning low. The castle has become quiet. And she is lying in a room that is technically hers now, but it does not feel like home. The walls are unfamiliar. The servants are unfamiliar. The sounds outside are unfamiliar. Her husband may be nearby, or he may already be planning his next journey. She has left one life behind, and another has begun. She may eventually become powerful. She may become beloved. She may become a mother. She may become a widow. She may become a regent. She may even become the person who quietly keeps an entire kingdom functioning, while everyone else argues about who deserves a throne. But tonight, she is simply tired. So let the castle grow quiet again. Let the footsteps fade down the corridor. Let the fire settle. And let the princess sleep. Because tomorrow there will be children. And children in medieval royal families were never simply children. They were heirs. They were alliances. They were future kings and queens. And sometimes they were the beginning of an entirely new royal problem. So we'll gently move toward them next. Hey guys, tonight we continue our quiet journey into the life of the medieval princess. By now, she has left home. She has crossed the roads and rivers of Europe. She has entered another court. She has married a man chosen partly, and sometimes almost entirely, for political reasons. And now comes the next great expectation. Children, lots of children, ideally, healthy children, legitimate children, and preferably at least one son who will eventually inherit something expensive. Because in medieval royal families, Having a baby was rarely allowed to remain simply a family matter. A royal baby arrived carrying an entire political future with it. So settle back down, dim the lights, let the room stay quiet, and imagine a medieval palace waking slowly in the morning. The fire is being prepared. Servants are moving through the corridors. Somewhere, bread is being baked. A messenger has arrived. A clerk is already writing. And inside the royal apartments, a young princess who is now a queen is learning that motherhood in a dynasty is a rather unusual occupation. There is love, certainly. There is affection. There is pride. But there is also paperwork. Quite a lot of paperwork. Because once a royal child was born, people immediately began thinking about inheritance. Who was this child? Who would they marry? What land might they receive? Who would become their guardian? What political alliances could be created through them? And perhaps most importantly, would they survive? That last question was never far away. Medieval childhood was dangerous. Disease was common. Medical treatment was limited. Infant mortality was high. Even wealthy families could lose children. Royal families were not protected from this. They had better food. They had servants. They had access to physicians. They could sometimes isolate sick children. But wealth could not eliminate disease. So a royal mother might have several children and still end up with only some of them reaching adulthood. This is one reason medieval kings and queens often had many children. It was not simply because they loved large families. There was a practical reason. If you needed an heir, it was safer to have several children. If one died, another might survive. If the eldest son died, the second son could inherit. If there were no sons, daughters might become important. The dynasty needed options, and medieval dynasties loved options, preferably several. The royal nursery could therefore become a busy place. But the mother did not necessarily raise every child herself. Royal children were often surrounded by nurses, servants, tutors, priests, and attendants. Noble households had systems for childcare. A wet nurse might feed an infant. Nurses cared for young children. Older children could have tutors. The queen remained an important figure, but she was not necessarily involved in every small detail of daily childcare. This was partly because royal households were enormous. It was also because children were being prepared for specific roles. A prince needed education. A princess needed education too, though the content could differ. Boys who were expected to rule might study Latin, religion, law, history, diplomacy, and military matters. Girls might be taught religion, household management, languages, music, reading, and embroidery. But aristocratic women could also be educated quite seriously. Some learned to read and write. Some became patrons of literature. Some were deeply involved in religious learning. And some became remarkably well educated by the standards of their time. A medieval princess might grow up surrounded by books. Not shelves and shelves of them like a modern library. Books were expensive. Manuscripts were copied by hand. Parchment was valuable. Illustration took time. So owning books was a sign of wealth. A royal woman could possess prayer books, religious texts, romances, histories, or collections of letters. Reading was not universal, but literacy existed among aristocratic women, and royal courts could be surprisingly intellectual places. This matters because the medieval princess was not simply being trained to look attractive beside her future husband. She was being prepared to function in a complex political and religious society. She might need to understand correspondence. She might need to recognize important names. She might need to know how to conduct herself in a diplomatic setting. She might need to supervise her household. And if she became regent, she might need to understand much more. So education mattered. But there was another kind of education happening at the same time. Political education. A young princess learned by watching adults. She watched her mother receive visitors. She watched her father negotiate. She saw which nobles were trusted. She noticed who had influence. She learned which relatives were dangerous. She learned which marriages mattered. And she learned that people rarely said exactly what they meant. This was perhaps one of the most useful skills a medieval royal could acquire, because court politics was rarely direct. Someone might say, "We are delighted with this arrangement," which could mean, "We hate this arrangement, but we cannot safely say so." Someone might say, "We will consider your request," which could mean, "No." And someone might arrive with a gift, a very expensive gift, which might mean, "Please remember that I exist when you are deciding who gets that castle." Human diplomacy has always had its little subtleties. The princess had to learn them, and eventually she might have to teach them to her own children, because royal children were political creatures almost from birth. A prince could be promised in marriage before he fully understood what marriage was. A princess could be promised to another dynasty, and sometimes siblings were deliberately separated. One child might be sent to another court, another might be placed in a religious institution, another might remain with the mother. The purpose was often political. A child could serve as a hostage. A marriage alliance could be strengthened by sending a child to live with the other family. A noble family could demonstrate loyalty by accepting a royal child into its household. This was not necessarily done with cruelty. It was simply part of the political culture. But imagine being a young child sent away from your parents. The historical record might say, at the age of 7, she was sent to the court of, and then the sentence continues. But that sentence represents a huge emotional change. A child leaves home, new servants, new tutors, new language, new food, new routines, new expectations, and perhaps no familiar parent nearby. Some children adapted. Some became close to their new households. Some remained attached to their birth families. And some probably felt lonely. Again, the records rarely tell us enough, but we can see the pattern. Royal childhood was not necessarily stable. The family itself could be scattered across Europe. This was especially true when children grew older. Marriage alliances sent sons and daughters in different directions. A princess might have sisters living in France, Spain, Germany, or Italy. Her brothers might be fighting somewhere else. Her parents might be separated. And letters became essential. Letters were one of the great tools of medieval royal life. A queen might write to her son. A princess might write to her mother. A king might send instructions. A daughter might ask for money. A mother might give advice. A royal woman could use letters to maintain relationships across enormous distances. And sometimes these letters are among the best sources we have for understanding medieval women, because letters reveal personality. They can show affection, frustration, concern, anger, and sometimes a rather impressive ability to complain, which, frankly, is another timeless human tradition. One woman who left an extraordinary collection of letters was Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter, Marie of Champagne. Marie was married to Henry I, Count of Champagne. She became a major patron of literature. Her court was associated with the development of courtly culture and literature. This was a world where stories of love, knights, honor, and noble behavior became increasingly popular. The irony is rather pleasant. Royal marriages themselves were often arranged for political reasons. Yet the courts that hosted these marriages helped create some of the great literary traditions of romantic love. So medieval Europe could essentially say, your marriage is politically arranged, but here's a poem about eternal romantic devotion. Because why not? Reality and fantasy could comfortably exist beside each other. And royal women were part of this cultural world. They could sponsor writers. They could support religious institutions. They could commission manuscripts. They could become patrons of art. This gave some princesses a form of influence that did not depend on armies. Culture could be power too. A queen who supported a monastery could strengthen her relationship with the church. A princess who patronized a writer could help shape the reputation of her court. A royal woman who founded a convent could create a lasting religious institution. These activities mattered. They left physical evidence. Churches, tombs, manuscripts, charters, donations, And sometimes those records tell us much more about women than the official political histories do. Let's slowly move back toward the family, because the royal nursery was also a place where rivalries could begin. Siblings did not always get along. That should not surprise anyone. Being born into a royal family did not magically remove sibling jealousy. If anything, it probably made it worse. Imagine being the second son. Your older brother is the heir. Everyone treats him differently. He gets the important education. He is prepared to rule. People flatter him. Nobles seek his friendship. You are still a prince. You have enormous privileges. But you also know that your older brother is the person who gets the throne, unless something happens. And suddenly, inheritance becomes personal. This could create tensions between brothers. It could also create tensions between brothers and sisters. A princess might be married to strengthen one alliance. Her brother might dislike the arrangement. Another sibling might receive more land. Someone might believe they deserve a particular title. And because these were families with enormous resources, disagreements could become politically significant. A family argument could become a noble rebellion. A disagreement between brothers could become a civil war. A marriage dispute could involve multiple kingdoms. It was family drama with armies attached. Fortunately, we are not going to spend tonight listening to armies. We'll keep things quiet. But we should remember the background. Every medieval royal family contained the possibility of conflict, and mothers often found themselves in the middle. A queen could have several sons with competing ambitions. She might favor one. Her husband might favor another. The nobles might support a third. And the mother had to navigate all of it. Sometimes she tried to keep the family united. Sometimes she became openly partisan. And sometimes she became the central political figure because everyone trusted her more than they trusted one another. Blanche of Castile is again a good example. When her son Louis IX became king, Blanche had to protect his position. She was not simply waiting for him to grow up. She was actively involved in governing. She faced political opposition. She negotiated. She managed alliances. She maintained the monarchy. And she did it while being a mother. The image of the medieval queen, therefore, becomes more complicated. She could be a mother and a politician at the same time. She could love her children and still think about their inheritance. She could worry about their health while planning their marriages. She could comfort them while preparing them for political responsibilities. There was no clear separation between family life and statecraft. The family was the state. This was particularly true in dynastic monarchies. The kingdom was not an abstract institution in the modern sense. It was tied closely to the royal household. Who belonged to the family mattered. Who was legitimate mattered. Who was born first mattered. Who was male mattered. Who had the strongest claim mattered. And all of these questions could remain unresolved for years, sometimes decades. Now, let's imagine the princess herself as a child, before she became a bride, before she became a queen, before anyone cared about her marriage prospects. She might have spent her early years playing with siblings. She might have had dolls or small household toys. She might have learned songs. She might have attended religious services. She might have played games with other children. She might have ridden horses if her family encouraged it. She might have enjoyed hunting or outdoor activities. She might have been frightened of thunderstorms. She might have hated certain foods. She might have loved a particular dog. These small details rarely survive in history, and that is a shame, because they remind us that historical figures were once children. A princess who later became a famous queen was once just a little girl trying to understand the world. She did not know which wars would happen. She did not know whom she would marry. She did not know whether she would become powerful. She did not know whether she would outlive her husband. She simply grew up. And while she grew, adults made plans. Sometimes those plans changed. A marriage could be canceled. An alliance could collapse. A prospective husband could die. A new political opportunity could appear. This happened often. A princess might be betrothed to one man and then marry another. A king might promise his daughter to a foreign prince, only for the arrangement to become inconvenient. A child might die before the marriage could take place. Political situations could change rapidly, so the princess had to remain adaptable. And there was another problem: travel. If she married into another kingdom, she might have to move again and again. Some royal women spent much of their lives traveling between residences. A king's court could be itinerant. There was not necessarily one capital city where everyone stayed permanently. The royal household moved. This meant packing, unpacking, traveling, setting up the household, then doing it all again. Imagine moving your entire home every few months. Now add 50 servants and a collection of valuable religious objects and documents and clothes and furniture and horses and food. Suddenly modern moving day looks almost peaceful. Yet this was normal for many medieval royal households. The princess had to adapt to movement. She had to maintain her household. She had to remain presentable. She had to perform her duties wherever the court happened to be. And sometimes she was traveling while pregnant. Again, medieval royal life was not exactly designed around convenience. But despite all this, royal women could create a sense of home wherever they went. Their household moved with them. Their chaplains came. Their ladies came. Their servants came. Their personal possessions came. And perhaps most importantly, their memories came. A princess might carry objects from childhood: a religious relic, a piece of jewelry, a manuscript, a small personal item, something that reminded her of home. These objects could be emotionally meaningful, because when everything else changed, familiar objects remained. And perhaps this is where the fairy tale image becomes slightly more human. The princess was not simply living in a beautiful castle. She was constantly adapting. She was learning new people, new expectations, new responsibilities. And sometimes she was doing all of this while still very young. The transition from childhood to political adulthood could be remarkably fast. A girl might be considered a marriage prospect while still in her early teens. Her education could shift to her household and dynastic responsibilities. She might begin receiving more formal duties, and eventually she might be married. The exact age varied, and we should avoid imagining that every medieval princess married as a child. Some married later. Some were widowed young. Some never married. But the expectation of marriage was strong. For dynastic daughters, remaining unmarried was often difficult to justify. There were exceptions. Religious life provided another path. Some royal daughters entered convents. This could be a genuine religious vocation. It could also be politically convenient. A daughter who was not needed for a marriage alliance could be placed in a religious institution. A royal convent could also provide status and protection. And some women became powerful abbesses. An abbess could manage land. She could supervise a community. She could correspond with nobles. She could administer property. She could sometimes exercise considerable authority. So even outside marriage, royal women could have roles. But the path of marriage remained the most common political destination. And once married, the princess's relationship with her husband became central. If the husband was kind, the marriage could become supportive. If he was distant, the queen might rely more heavily on her household. If he was politically ambitious, she might become involved in his plans. If he was weak, she might take on more responsibility. And if he was difficult, well, she had to find a way to survive the relationship. There was no modern divorce system available in the ordinary sense. The church treated marriage as a sacrament. Annulments could happen, but they were complicated. And political marriages made them even more complicated. Eleanor of Aquitaine's annulment from Louis VII was possible because of their close kinship and lack of male heirs. But the consequences were enormous. She quickly remarried Henry. Her lands remained with her. And suddenly, the political map of Western Europe shifted. This tells us something important. A medieval princess could sometimes escape one political arrangement and enter another. but she rarely escaped politics altogether. Politics followed her. Her inheritance followed her. Her children followed her. Her name followed her. And her reputation followed her. Reputation was incredibly important. A queen who was considered pious might receive praise from chroniclers. A queen who was accused of being ambitious could become a villain in later histories. A woman who challenged male authority might be portrayed as troublesome. A woman who supported her husband might be praised as loyal. The same behavior could be interpreted differently depending on who was writing. This is why medieval women can be difficult to understand. We often meet them through the words of people who had their own agendas. A chronicler might dislike a queen. Another might admire her. One might describe her as proud. Another might call her strong. And sometimes both descriptions refer to the same person. So when we look back at the medieval princess, we should be cautious. She was not simply a helpless victim. She was not always a powerful feminist heroine either. She was a human being living inside a rigid political system. Sometimes she had choices. Sometimes she had very few. Sometimes she used the opportunities available to her. Sometimes she suffered because of the limitations around her. And sometimes she managed to turn those limitations into power. As the evening moves on, imagine the royal nursery becoming quiet. The children are sleeping. The nurses have finished their work. The queen has finally left the nursery. Tomorrow there will be lessons. There will be prayers. There will be meals. There will be letters. And eventually there will be marriages. Because the little princess sleeping in that room is not simply a child. She is someone's future alliance, someone's future queen, someone's future mother, and perhaps, if the dynasty is lucky, someone's future regent. The kingdom is already waiting for her. She just doesn't know it yet. So let the candles burn quietly. Let the castle settle into the night. And let the children sleep beneath their heavy blankets. Because in the morning, the politics will begin again. And as our story continues, we will follow the princess beyond childhood, into the strange world of courtly expectations, into marriage, into motherhood, and into the peculiar reality of being a woman whose personal life could affect an entire kingdom. For now, though, the corridors are quiet, the household is resting, and for one brief night, nobody is asking the princess who she is going to marry, which by medieval standards is probably a pretty good night. Hey guys, tonight we continue our slow journey through the life of the medieval princess. By now, our princess has grown up surrounded by expectations. She has learned how to behave at court. She has watched her parents negotiate. She has seen relatives arrive and leave. She has probably learned that a smile can mean several different things depending on who is smiling. And eventually the moment arrives. Marriage. The great event that everyone has been discussing since she was young. The ceremony is beautiful. There are fine clothes. There are prayers. There are guests. There is food. There is music. And somewhere beneath all of it is a rather practical question. What happens tomorrow? Because the medieval wedding was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the job. So settle in. Keep the lights low. Let the world outside become quiet for a while. And imagine the morning after a royal wedding. The guests are leaving. The musicians have gone. The tables are being cleared. The expensive fabrics are being packed away. And the newly married princess is waking up in a place that is supposed to be her new home. She may still feel like a stranger. Her husband may still be unfamiliar. His relatives may be watching her carefully. And she is now expected to become part of the dynasty. That meant learning the household, learning the political relationships, learning the religious traditions of her new court, and learning how to be a queen. The title did not automatically make someone powerful. A queen had to understand how the court worked. She had to know which nobles were important. She had to know which bishops had influence. She had to know which members of the royal family were close to the king. She had to understand the finances of her household. She had to know how to receive ambassadors. And she had to appear calm even when things were going badly. This was not necessarily taught through formal classes. Much of it came through observation. A young queen watched. She listened. She learned. And sometimes she made mistakes. That was unavoidable, because every court had its own rules. The customs of England were not identical to those of France. The court of Castile was not the same as the court of Sicily. The Byzantine imperial court had its own elaborate traditions, and a foreign princess had to adapt. This could take time. Language was particularly important. A princess might know several languages. Latin was important for educated Europeans and the church. French was widely used among aristocratic circles in Western Europe. Local languages mattered too. A queen who could communicate directly with people could be more effective. She could read letters. She could understand petitions. She could speak with nobles. She could communicate with her household. And she could sometimes keep important conversations private. Language, in other words, was power. A princess who arrived from another country might bring her own language and culture. Her household could preserve these traditions. She might introduce new foods, new fashions, new books, new religious practices, new artistic styles. Royal marriages could therefore influence culture. They moved people across borders, and people carried ideas with them. This is one of the quieter ways medieval princesses changed history. They were diplomatic connections between different worlds. They were not simply transported from one castle to another. They brought culture with them. And sometimes that cultural influence lasted for generations. But the first responsibility remained the same. Children. The dynasty wanted heirs. A young queen could feel the pressure almost immediately. There might be no time to settle comfortably into marriage. The expectation was clear. She needed to become pregnant. If months passed without a pregnancy, people noticed. If years passed, people became anxious. And if a royal marriage produced no children, the situation could become politically dangerous. Infertility was poorly understood. Medieval people did not have our understanding of reproductive biology. When a marriage produced no children, blame could fall on either partner. But women often carried more of it. A queen might be accused of being barren. She might be criticized. Her position could become weaker. The king might seek an annulment. And even if the cause of infertility had nothing to do with her, she could still suffer the consequences. This was deeply unfair. But medieval society was not organized around fairness. It was organized around inheritance. And inheritance demanded children. A successful queen, therefore, had a strange task. She had to produce heirs, raise children, maintain her household, support her husband, maintain political relationships, participate in religious life, and appear graceful while doing all of it, and preferably without complaining, because complaining was apparently not considered an important royal skill, though one suspects many queens became excellent at it privately. Let's move gently to the subject of pregnancy. For medieval women, pregnancy was physically demanding. For royal women, there was an additional layer. People were watching. A queen's pregnancy could become public knowledge. Her household would prepare. Physicians and midwives would become involved. Religious practices could accompany the pregnancy. Prayers might be said. Relics might be brought. Special foods might be prepared. The queen might withdraw from some public activities. As the birth approached, the women around her became increasingly important. Childbirth was primarily managed by women. Midwives played a central role. Female relatives and attendants might also be present. The king might not be in the room. This was a women's space, and it could be an intense one. But we will keep our story gentle. There is no need to dwell on the medical dangers. The important point is that childbirth was a major part of a royal woman's life, and the outcome mattered enormously. A son could strengthen the succession. A daughter could create another future marriage alliance. Twins could create complicated inheritance questions. A child who died could create grief and political uncertainty. Every birth changed a family, and sometimes it changed a kingdom. Consider the children of Eleanor of Aquitaine. She and Henry II had a large family. Their children included William, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, John, Matilda, Eleanor, and Joanna. Not all survived childhood, but the surviving children became major political figures. The sons, in particular, would shape the future of England and Western Europe. Henry the young king became a crowned king during his father's lifetime. Richard became Richard the Lionheart. John became King John. Their family relationships were complicated, very complicated. The father was powerful. The sons were ambitious. The mother had her own political influence. And eventually, tensions within the family became serious. Eleanor supported her sons during conflicts with Henry II. She was imprisoned by Henry for many years. That is one of the darker moments of her life. But even then, the larger story is not simply about a queen being trapped. It is about a family in which personal relationships and political authority were inseparable. Henry was her husband. Her sons were his heirs. And the question of who would inherit what was always present. The royal family could love each other and still compete. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. A son could love his father and still want more power. A mother could love her husband and still support her children. A king could love his sons and still fear their ambitions. Medieval dynastic families were human families. They simply had more castles and more consequences. Let's move away from England for a moment. Imagine a princess arriving in Iberia. The kingdoms of medieval Iberia were politically complicated. Christian kingdoms were expanding and competing with one another. Muslim states controlled large areas of the peninsula. Marriage alliances could connect kingdoms. A princess might be sent south. Another might travel north. The cultural environment could be different from Northern Europe. Languages varied. Religious communities lived alongside one another in many regions. And royal women could become important intermediaries. Marriage did not erase cultural differences. A princess might retain traditions from her homeland. Her children could grow up exposed to more than one culture. This was one of the subtle consequences of royal marriage. Children of royal couples could inherit more than land. They inherited languages, customs, stories, religious traditions, political connections, and sometimes conflicting identities. A princess might have been born in one kingdom, raised in another, married into a third. Her children could have claims in several directions. The medieval world was interconnected in ways that are easy to underestimate. The roads were slow. Messages took time. But dynastic relationships created a network stretching across Europe. Royal families were constantly exchanging people, and princesses were among the most important people moving through that network. This is why genealogy matters so much in medieval history. A marriage can look insignificant when viewed as a single event, but trace the descendants. Suddenly, you see the consequences. One princess marries one prince. Their daughter marries another king. Their grandson claims another throne. A century later, someone invokes that ancestry to justify a war, and everyone begins pulling out genealogical charts. Because apparently nothing says relaxation like a disputed medieval succession. Still, for the princess herself, the process was much simpler. She was living her life. She probably was not thinking about how historians 700 years later would analyze her marriage. She was thinking about practical things. Her children, her household, her husband, her health, her religious obligations, her friends, her letters, her possessions, and perhaps what was for dinner. This is why small details can be so valuable. We sometimes know what medieval queens owned: jewelry, clothing, books, religious objects, furniture, animals. These objects tell us something about their daily lives. A queen might have a collection of embroidered garments. She might own a psalter. She might have gold or silver vessels. She might have relics. She might have jewelry passed down from her mother. She might have horses. She might receive gifts from her husband. And these possessions were not necessarily purely decorative. Jewelry could represent inheritance. Books could represent education. Religious objects could represent devotion. Clothing represented status. And gifts could represent political relationships. Everything had meaning. Even letters could be carefully preserved. A queen's correspondence might contain instructions about money, requests for news, arrangements for marriages, discussions about children, religious concerns, and sometimes personal affection. Letters also reveal how quickly information could become outdated. A message sent from England to France might take days or weeks. By the time it arrived, circumstances could have changed. A prince might have become sick. A nobleman might have changed sides. A marriage proposal might have become irrelevant. So medieval politics was slow communication combined with fast-changing events. A rather unfortunate combination. Yet royal women managed it. They sent messengers. They wrote letters. They relied on trusted servants. And they developed networks of information. A queen needed to know what was happening. Ignorance could be dangerous. If a rebellion was developing, she needed to know. If a noble family was unhappy, she needed to know. If her husband was planning something, she probably wanted to know. And if her son was sick, she certainly wanted to know. Information was power. The queen's household could therefore function as an information network. Servants traveled. Clerks wrote. Messengers arrived. Visitors carried news. And women at court were often much more politically informed than older histories sometimes suggest. There's another aspect of royal life that deserves attention. Religion. Medieval society was deeply religious. For a princess, religion was not simply a private belief. It shaped the calendar, the rituals, the ceremonies, the rules of marriage, the education of children, the structure of society. A queen could be expected to attend mass. She might sponsor religious foundations. She might make donations. She could have a personal confessor. She might go on pilgrimage. She might collect religious books. And she might spend considerable time in prayer. Some royal women were especially devout. Others were more politically focused. Most were probably somewhere in between. People are rarely as simple as historical labels suggest. A queen could be both religious and ambitious. She could be both loving and politically calculating. She could care about her family while also thinking about inheritance. There was no contradiction. That was simply life. Religion could also provide women with a certain kind of authority. A queen who was known for generosity toward the church could gain moral prestige. She might become associated with charity. She could support hospitals or monasteries. She could donate land. She could establish religious houses. These actions created a legacy. Long after her death, people might remember her as a founder. Her tomb might be placed in an important church. Her name might appear in religious records. Her descendants might continue her patronage. This was one way medieval women could shape the historical landscape, not through armies, not through formal political office, but through institutions that lasted. A monastery could survive for centuries. A church could stand long after a dynasty had disappeared. A manuscript could preserve a woman's name. A donation charter could record her authority. These traces matter. They remind us that medieval princesses were not merely decorations in royal marriages. They could leave fingerprints on the world. Still, life at court could be lonely. This is perhaps the quietest part of the story. A princess might be surrounded by people all day. Servants, ladies, nobles, clergy, children, messengers, visitors, and yet she could feel isolated. Most people around her had responsibilities toward her. Some served her. Some wanted something from her. Some were loyal. Some were ambitious. It could be difficult to know who genuinely cared. Her position created distance. She was important, and importance can be isolating. A queen could not simply walk into a market and chat with strangers. She could not easily disappear for an afternoon. Her movements were visible. Her relationships were watched. Her reputation mattered. And if she made a mistake, it might be recorded. Sometimes exaggerated. Sometimes distorted. sometimes remembered for centuries. So the medieval princess had to live carefully. Not always, but often. Her public identity mattered, and she learned to separate the private woman from the public queen. That distinction is still familiar today, but for medieval royalty it could be extreme. The queen might smile during a ceremony, then return to her chamber and finally relax. She might greet an ambassador politely, then privately complain about the entire meeting. She might praise a noble woman in public, then tell her ladies that the woman was impossible. Again, people have not changed quite as much as we like to imagine. As the evening grows quieter, we can imagine the queen finally alone. Her children are sleeping. The household is settled. The candles flicker. There are letters waiting for tomorrow. There are decisions waiting too. Her husband may be away. Her son may be growing into a political figure. Her daughter may soon be promised in marriage. And the queen knows that her own childhood is now far behind her. She has become part of a dynasty. Her identity has changed. She is no longer simply the daughter of one family. She is the wife of another. And perhaps, more importantly, she is now the mother of its future. That can be a powerful position, but it can also be a heavy one. Because when your children inherit kingdoms, their mistakes become political problems. When your husband quarrels with his nobles, you may be pulled into the dispute. When your daughter is married away, you may never see her regularly again. And when your son becomes ambitious, you may find yourself caught between love and loyalty. That is where many royal families began to unravel, not because everyone hated everyone, but because everyone wanted something. A title, a territory, a marriage, an inheritance, a little more independence, a little more authority, and sometimes simply a little more attention from the king. So tonight, as we let the medieval palace settle back into silence, remember the princess at the center of it. She was not waiting for a fairy tale ending. She was living inside a system that expected her to become useful. Useful to her family, useful to her husband, useful to the dynasty, and sometimes, remarkably, she became useful to herself as well. She learned, she adapted, she negotiated, she survived, and in some cases, she became far more powerful than anyone had expected. But there was still another side of the story waiting, because eventually husbands died, children grew up, dynasties changed, and the princess who had once been sent away from home could suddenly find herself older, widowed, and holding an unexpected amount of power. Sometimes that was freedom, sometimes it was danger, and sometimes it was both. For now, though, the queen can rest. The fire is low, the corridors are quiet, the children are sleeping. Tomorrow will bring another letter, another decision, another political problem. Of course it will. But tonight, there is nothing solved. So let the castle grow still, and let the queen close her eyes, because her life as a medieval princess may have begun with a marriage contract, but the most interesting part of her story may come after the marriage is over. Hey guys, tonight we continue our slow journey through the life of the medieval princess. By now, she is no longer the young girl who first left home. She has crossed borders. She has married. She has learned the strange customs of another court. She has had children. She has watched those children grow. And she has spent years learning how to survive inside a world where almost everything about her life had political meaning. But eventually, something happened to almost every medieval marriage. One person died. And when a royal husband died, the entire life of his wife could change overnight. Sometimes the change was frightening. Sometimes it was liberating. Sometimes it was both at the same time. So settle in again. Dim the lights. Let the room become quiet. And imagine a medieval queen sitting alone in her chamber after receiving the news that her husband is dead. The candles are burning. The servants are waiting. People are whispering in the corridors. And somewhere beyond the room, nobles are already wondering what happens next, because there is no pause button in medieval politics. The king may have died, but the kingdom has not, and the queen is still there, Sometimes she is a widow. Sometimes she is the mother of an heir. Sometimes her son is already an adult. And sometimes her son is a child. That last situation could transform her life completely. If the heir was too young to rule, someone had to govern, and that person could be the queen mother. This was one of the most unusual paths to power available to medieval women. A woman who had spent years being introduced primarily as someone's wife could suddenly become the person responsible for protecting the throne. She might become regent. She could oversee government. She could negotiate with nobles. She could manage finances. She could issue instructions. And she might have to deal with men who believed they should be in charge, which naturally could become slightly awkward. A young king was surrounded by ambitious nobles. Some genuinely wanted to help. Others wanted influence. Some believed they had a better claim to power. A regent, therefore, had to balance competing interests. She could not simply order everyone around. She needed alliances. She needed loyal supporters. She needed money. And she needed legitimacy. Her authority came from her relationship with the young king. She was his mother. She was a late king's widow. She was acting in his name. That could be enough. But it could also be challenged. Blanche of Castile provides one of the best examples. After the death of Louis VIII, their son Louis IX was only 12. Blanche became regent. She had already spent years learning court politics. Now she had to use that knowledge. She faced rebellious nobles. She negotiated. She managed the kingdom. And she protected her son's authority. She also had to prepare him for kingship. This was not merely a temporary administrative job. She was raising a future king. And eventually, Louis IX became one of the most important monarchs of medieval France. Later, he would be remembered as St. Louis. Blanche's influence did not disappear when her son became an adult. She continued to play a major role in his government. And this shows how motherhood could create political authority. The same child who had made a woman vulnerable could also become the source of her power. That contradiction appears repeatedly in medieval history. A queen's children could be her greatest responsibility. They could also be her greatest political protection. But widowhood did not always lead to power. Sometimes it meant insecurity. A widow might have to defend her property. She might have to negotiate her dower rights. She might have to depend on her husband's family. And if she had no surviving children, her position could become uncertain. A young widow could also be expected to remarry. Again, because medieval dynasties like marriage solved problems. Marriage created alliances. Marriage transferred property. Marriage produced heirs. And apparently, if one marriage ended, there was always another political problem waiting nearby. A widow might therefore find herself being considered for another husband almost immediately. Sometimes she wanted to remarry. Sometimes she did not. But her family might have strong opinions. Her land might be involved. Her children might be involved. The political situation might demand it. So even after surviving one arranged marriage, she might find herself entering another. Some women did eventually choose religious life instead. Others remained widows. And some deliberately avoided remarriage because widowhood gave them more independence than marriage had. That is an interesting point. A married queen had obligations to her husband. A widow with property could sometimes make her own decisions. She could manage her lands. She could maintain her household. She could support religious institutions. She could travel. She could negotiate. She might still have political responsibilities. But she was no longer required to obey a husband. For some women, that could be a form of freedom. Not complete freedom. Certainly not. But more freedom than they had experienced before. And this is where the fairy tale becomes especially strange. The princess's life had been presented as a journey toward marriage. Marriage was supposed to be the destination. Yet, sometimes the period after marriage gave her more authority than marriage itself. A widow could become the head of her own household. She might have servants who answered directly to her. She might control estates. She could correspond with officials. And if she had adult children, She could influence the next generation. A woman who had once been a bride could become a family matriarch. And matriarchs could be formidable. Let's think about Eleanor of Aquitaine again. Her life after Henry II's death was not the quiet retirement of an elderly widow. She remained politically active. Her son Richard became king. When Richard was away on crusade, Eleanor played a major role in the government of England. She traveled. She negotiated. She acted on behalf of her son. And when Richard died, the succession became complicated. John eventually became king. Eleanor supported John's position. She was by then an older woman, but age had not made her relevant. Quite the opposite. She had decades of experience. She understood the political world. She knew the major families. She had relationships across Europe. She knew how royal marriages worked. She had been Queen of France, then Queen of England. She had raised children who became kings. And she had survived political conflict with one of the most powerful men of her generation. That is a remarkable resume. The young princess who had once arrived at the French court had become an elderly woman whose political importance stretched across several kingdoms. This is why we should be careful with the phrase medieval princess. It sounds as though the story ends when she becomes a queen, but in many cases, that was only the beginning. Her life could last decades. She could experience multiple political eras. She might outlive her husband. She might outlive several children. She might see grandchildren become kings. And she might become the person everyone else turned to when the younger generation made a mess, which naturally happened. Royal families were very talented at making messes. Sometimes the biggest problem was succession. Who would inherit? The eldest son? The younger son? A daughter? A nephew? A cousin? A child from another marriage? The rules were not always perfectly clear. Different kingdoms had different traditions. Custom mattered. Gender mattered. Legitimacy mattered. And sometimes the law itself was disputed. This created opportunities for ambitious relatives. A queen mother might find herself defending her child's claim. She might have to persuade nobles. She might write letters. She might arrange marriages. She might use money. And sometimes she had to rely on her reputation. A queen who had been respected for years could have enormous political capital. Her word carried weight. Her family connections mattered. People knew her. She knew them. And that long memory was powerful. This was one of the advantages of age. A young princess had beauty, youth, and a valuable marriage alliance. An older queen could have something different. Experience. She had seen how politics worked. She had seen people change sides. She had survived crises. She knew which promises could be trusted. She knew which ones could not. And she knew that the noblemen standing politely in front of her might have supported 3 different factions during the last decade. Experience teaches caution. Medieval courts rewarded caution. They also rewarded patience. A queen could not always act immediately. Sometimes she had to wait. Wait for a letter. Wait for a marriage. Wait for a child to grow. Wait for a political situation to change. And sometimes waiting was the best strategy. This is one reason medieval history can feel slow. The politics were slow. The travel was slow. Communication was slow. But human emotions were not. Jealousy could happen instantly. Anger could happen instantly. Fear could happen instantly. And a single emotional decision could have consequences that lasted years. Royal women had to navigate this. They had to know when to act and when to wait. Let's move gently to another important part of royal widowhood: property. A queen's financial position could determine her independence. Marriage arrangements often included a dower. This was property or income assigned to the wife. The details varied greatly, but in principle, a widow could receive lands or revenues intended to support her. If she controlled those resources, she had financial power. Money mattered. Without money, political influence was difficult. With money, a widow could maintain servants. She could support religious institutions. She could travel. She could reward allies. She could help her children. She could pay for legal disputes. She could defend her rights. So property was not just wealth, it was independence. This is why disputes over queens' dower lands could become serious. A queen might argue that certain estates belonged to her. Her husband's heirs might disagree. Officials might become involved. Documents were produced. Charters were examined. Witnesses were consulted. And suddenly, the glamorous princess in the castle had become deeply involved in property law. History is full of surprises. Some of the most important struggles of medieval women involved land, not romance, not war, land, because land generated income, land created influence, land supported households, and land could be inherited. A princess who brought an inheritance into marriage could remain politically valuable for her entire life. This was especially true for women who inherited large territories. Eleanor of Aquitaine was the obvious example. Her lands made her one of the most important heiresses in Europe, but there were many others. The principle was simple. If a woman inherited valuable property, her marriage became politically important. Her husband might gain access to those lands. Her children might inherit them. Her family might try to control them. And after her husband's death, she might attempt to retain them. So the medieval princess's relationship with property was central to her identity. She was not simply carrying jewels into a marriage. She could be carrying counties, castles, forests, towns, revenue, rights, and sometimes an entire political future. Let's return to the family, because one of the most difficult things about royal motherhood was watching children leave. A daughter would eventually marry. A son might receive his own lands. A child might be sent to another court. And once they left, the mother might see them rarely. Letters became important again. A queen might send gifts. She might receive news. She might worry about illnesses. She might hear rumors. And sometimes she would not know what was happening until a messenger arrived. Imagine being a mother and knowing that your child is hundreds of miles away. If they become sick, you cannot simply get into a car. You need horses. You need guards. You need roads. You need time. And by the time you arrive, the situation may have changed. Distance could make royal motherhood emotionally difficult, yet the family network depended on this movement. Children were political connections. Daughters married into other dynasties. Sons inherited lands. Grandchildren connected different kingdoms. The family became a web spread across Europe, and women were often at the center of that web. A queen could have sisters in one country, daughters in another, and sons in a third. She could correspond with all of them. She could exchange gifts. She could negotiate. She could encourage cooperation. And when disputes arose, she might try to mediate. This was especially important because women could sometimes communicate with relatives who were politically opposed to one another. A mother could write to her son. A sister could write to her brother. A daughter could write to her father. Family relationships created channels of communication that formal diplomacy could not always provide. Sometimes these channels worked. Sometimes they did not. But they existed, and that mattered. Another important aspect of medieval royal widowhood was reputation. A widow could choose how to present herself. Some adopted a visibly religious lifestyle. They wore simpler clothing. They supported monasteries. They emphasized prayer and charity. This could create an image of piety. It could also make political authority more acceptable. A religious widow could be respected. People might see her as wise, as experienced, as morally serious. And if she had political responsibilities, that reputation could help her. Of course, medieval people were not easily fooled. A queen could be deeply religious and politically ambitious at the same time. There was no contradiction. Religion and politics were intertwined. A woman could sincerely pray for her family while also making sure her son received the throne. She could donate to a monastery and negotiate a land dispute on the same afternoon. The medieval world did not require people to separate those identities. Now imagine the princess at the end of a long life. She has lived through marriages, births, deaths, political disputes, religious ceremonies, travel, court intrigues. She has seen children become adults. She has watched grandchildren arrive. Perhaps she has become a grandmother several times over, and now she is older. Her hair is gray. Her body is tired. The castle has changed. Some of the people she knew are gone. The political world around her is different, but she remains. This is another part of medieval history that deserves attention. Women could live long enough to become living memories. An elderly queen could remember events that younger generations only knew from stories. She could remember previous kings, previous marriages, old alliances, old disputes. She knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking, and sometimes, quite literally. Her memory was valuable. She could advise younger relatives. She could explain family relationships. She could remember agreements. She could provide context. In a world without modern archives accessible to everyone, personal memory mattered. And an old queen could possess a remarkable amount of it. So the princess who once seemed powerless could eventually become one of the most experienced people in the entire dynasty. That transformation is perhaps one of the most interesting things about medieval royal women. Their power was not always immediate. Sometimes it accumulated. Marriage gave connections. Motherhood gave influence. Widowhood gave independence. Age gave experience. And together, these could produce something powerful. Not always, but sometimes. As the night grows deeper, let's return to our imaginary castle. The queen is older now. The young girl who once arrived here has disappeared into memory. She has become part of the dynasty. Her children have their own households. Her grandchildren are being educated. The servants know her habits. The corridors are familiar. The castle that once felt strange has become home. Perhaps she keeps a few objects from her childhood. A ring, a book, a piece of jewelry, a religious image. Something small. Something that survived all those journeys. And maybe when she holds it, she remembers the first castle. The place she left when she was young. She remembers her parents, her siblings, the people who raised her, the world before marriage. And perhaps she realizes that the fairy tale was never really about the castle. The castle was simply the setting. The real story was adaptation. She was sent away. She adapted. She married. She adapted again. She became a mother. She learned. She became a widow. She found new authority. She aged. And somehow, she continued, that was the quiet resilience of many medieval women. They did not always control the system, but they learned how to live inside it. Sometimes they resisted. Sometimes they negotiated. Sometimes they accepted. Sometimes they quietly changed the rules around them. And sometimes history remembered them as queens, as mothers, as founders, as regents, as heiresses, and sometimes simply as someone's wife, even when they had been much more than that. So tonight, let the old queen rest. The candles are low. The corridors are empty. The household is asleep. There are no messengers arriving tonight. No marriage contracts. No succession disputes. No nobleman asking for favors. For a few quiet hours, she is simply an old woman in a familiar room. And perhaps that is the closest thing to a fairy tale ending she ever received. Not a prince. Not a glass slipper. Not a magical castle. Just a quiet room. A life finally slowing down. And the knowledge that she survived it. But our journey is not finished yet. Because there is another side of the medieval princess's life we have not fully explored. The strange rules placed upon royal women. The expectations of beauty. The pressure to behave correctly. The way chroniclers judge queens. And the unfortunate habit medieval society had of turning women into symbols. A good queen, a bad queen, a beautiful queen, a wicked queen, a pious queen, a troublesome queen. Labels were easy. Real people were not. So as the night settles over the castle, we will leave the old queen here for now. Tomorrow, we will slowly look at the reputation of the medieval princess and discover how easily a woman could become a legend or a villain, sometimes simply because somebody decided to write about her. Sleep well, the castle can wait. Hey guys, tonight we continue our quiet journey through the life of the medieval princess. By now, our princess has lived through most of the things that once seemed impossible. She left home. She entered a foreign court. She married. She became a mother. She watched her children grow. She dealt with a strange mixture of affection and politics that came with being part of a dynasty. Perhaps she became a widow. Perhaps she became a regent. Perhaps she became an older queen whose advice was suddenly more valuable than anyone had expected. But there is one thing she could never completely control: her reputation. And in the medieval world, reputation could become almost as important as reality. A queen could spend 40 years doing something one way. Then one chronicler could describe her differently. And suddenly, centuries later, everyone remembers the description. So tonight, let us slow down and look at the woman behind the label. The good queen, the bad queen, the beautiful queen, the proud queen, the sinful queen, the pious queen, the ambitious queen, the difficult queen. The list goes on. Medieval society loved categories. People were expected to fit into them. A queen was supposed to be beautiful, modest, generous, religious, loyal, fertile, and obedient, preferably all at once. And if she was also politically intelligent, that was useful, as long as nobody thought she was becoming too intelligent. That was sometimes where the trouble began. A medieval woman could be praised for being clever, but if she used that cleverness too openly, some writers might describe her as manipulative. If she defended her property, she could be called greedy. If she defended her children, she could be called ambitious. If she disagreed with her husband, she could be called disobedient. The same behavior could be described differently depending on who was telling the story. This is one of the biggest challenges when studying medieval queens. The sources are not neutral. Chroniclers had opinions. They had patrons. They belonged to political communities. They supported kings. They supported churches. They had moral expectations. And sometimes they simply disliked certain people. So when a chronicler tells us that a queen was proud, we should pause. What did proud mean? Did she refuse to obey? Did she speak too confidently? Did she insist on her rights? Did she dress too extravagantly? Did she simply annoy the writer? We cannot always know. The medieval princess lived in a world where gender expectations were strong. Women were expected to be modest. Men were expected to rule. Women could advise. Men could command. Of course, real life was messier. Queens ruled. Men sometimes failed. Women inherited. Men married heiresses. Women managed estates. Men traveled. And sometimes women were the most competent people in the room. But the cultural expectation remained. A queen should not appear to be trying too hard to rule. She should appear to support her husband, even when she was doing much of the work behind the scenes. This created an interesting political style. A queen could exercise influence while presenting herself as supportive. She might advise her husband privately. She might manage correspondence. She might help negotiate marriages. She might influence appointments. She might sponsor religious institutions. But publicly, she could emphasize loyalty. This was not necessarily deception. It was a way of working within the expectations of the time. And some women became very skilled at it. Eleanor of Aquitaine is again an obvious example. She was politically active. She controlled an enormous inheritance. She had been Queen of France, then Queen of England. She had several children who became major political figures. She supported her sons during their conflicts with Henry II. To some chroniclers, this made her a dangerous woman. To modern readers, she can look remarkably powerful. Both interpretations tell us something. The medieval world was uncomfortable with women who seemed to exercise too much independent authority, and yet it depended on powerful women. That contradiction never disappeared. A king needed his wife to manage things. but he might become suspicious if she managed too much. A queen was expected to advise, but not dominate, to be intelligent, but not arrogant, to be wealthy, but not greedy, to be beautiful, but not vain, to be religious, but not fanatical, to be loyal, but not independent. In other words, she had to be perfect, which sounds exhausting, and probably was. Beauty itself could become part of a queen's reputation. Medieval writers sometimes praise women's beauty, but beauty was not simply personal. It could be political. A beautiful princess could be described as desirable. A beautiful queen could become part of the image of the dynasty. Her clothing, her jewelry, her hair, her manners, everything could be noticed. But medieval standards of beauty were not identical to modern ones. We should be careful about projecting modern ideas backward. What mattered could include youth, health, elegance, complexion, hair, and overall appearance. But portraits from the Middle Ages often tell us little about actual appearance. They were not photographs. They were symbolic. A queen might be shown wearing a crown. Her clothing might emphasize rank. Her expression might be solemn. Her posture might communicate dignity. The artist was creating an image of authority, not necessarily capturing a candid moment. So when someone says a medieval queen looked a certain way, we often need to be cautious. We do not actually know. And sometimes later stories exaggerate beauty because beautiful women make convenient legends. The same is true of ugliness. A woman who was politically unpopular could be described as unattractive. This is an old literary trick. Good people become beautiful. Bad people become ugly. History becomes morality. Reality becomes much less tidy. Let's think about another important expectation. Charity. A good queen was expected to be generous. She might give money to the poor, support hospitals, donate to monasteries, provide food, support religious communities. These actions were politically useful. They were also religiously meaningful. Charity could strengthen a queen's reputation. A generous queen could be remembered as compassionate. A stingy queen could be criticized. So charity was both sincere and political. Again, these things could coexist. A queen could genuinely care about poor people. She could also understand that charity strengthened her public image. Humans are complicated. Medieval humans were no exception. Religion also shaped the image of the ideal queen. She was supposed to be pious. She should attend Mass. She should pray. She should respect the church. She should support religious institutions. And if she founded a monastery, even better. Some queens became especially associated with religious devotion. They might commission manuscripts. They might sponsor churches. They might collect relics. They might go on pilgrimage. And after death, they might become associated with local religious traditions. The idea of the saintly queen was powerful. A queen who lived a visibly religious life could become a model. The most famous examples include women like Margaret of Scotland. Margaret was born around 1045. She became Queen of Scotland through her marriage to Malcolm III. She was known for her piety. She supported religious reforms. She founded institutions. She was devoted to charity. After her death, she was canonized. Her reputation became that of a holy queen. But even here, we should remember that sanctity was part of a historical process. Her life was remembered and interpreted. Later generations emphasized particular qualities. The saintly queen became an ideal. She represented what a queen was supposed to be: religious, generous, devoted to family, humble. And yet, even Margaret was a political figure. She was married to a king. She was the mother of future rulers. She participated in court life. She influenced religious practice. So the categories overlap. Queen, mother, political figure, religious patron, wife, all at once. This is why simple labels can be misleading. Now let's turn to the opposite image. The wicked queen. Medieval literature loved her. She was ambitious, manipulative, jealous, perhaps sexually immoral. perhaps cruel, perhaps responsible for political disasters. She might be blamed for her husband's decisions. She might be accused of influencing him. And sometimes the accusation was simply that she was too powerful. Women who stepped outside expected roles could become convenient villains. One famous example is Isabella of France. She was born in 1295 and became Queen Consort of England through her marriage to Edward II. She was a daughter of King Philip IV of France. That alone made her politically important. Her marriage was part of the complicated relationship between England and France. But her marriage to Edward II became deeply troubled. Edward had powerful favorites. The relationship between the king and his nobles was unstable. Isabella's position became increasingly difficult. Eventually, she became involved in opposition to Edward. She returned to England with an army and played a major role in removing him from power. Later generations gave her a dramatic reputation. She became known as the She-Wolf of France. It is a memorable nickname. It is also a reminder of how history can turn a complicated political woman into a character. Isabella was not simply a villain. She was a queen operating inside a political crisis. She had grievances. She had allies. She had enemies. She made choices. Some were successful. Some were ruthless. Some were controversial. But she was a real person, not a medieval cartoon villain. The same is true of many royal women. They were judged by the standards of their time, and then judged again by later generations. Sometimes the later judgment was even harsher. This is especially true when women became involved in politics. A male king could be described as ambitious. A female queen might be described as scheming. A king could be called strong-willed. A queen might be called stubborn. A king could be decisive. A queen could be domineering. The language itself reveals expectations. But we should not swing too far in the opposite direction either. Not every medieval queen was secretly a brilliant feminist strategist. Some were ordinary. Some were politically passive. Some were deeply religious. Some were more interested in family. Some probably hated politics. Some may simply have wanted a quiet life. And some were genuinely difficult people. People are people. The Middle Ages did not produce a special species of human being. They produced the same mixture of kindness, ambition, jealousy, generosity, stubbornness, insecurity, and intelligence that we see today. The difference was the environment. A modern family argument might ruin a weekend. A medieval royal family argument could rearrange a kingdom. That is a rather significant upgrade in consequences. Let's slowly move toward the role of the princess before she even became a queen, because reputation could begin early. A princess might be praised for her beauty. Her behavior could be discussed. Her family could promote her image. If she was destined for an important marriage, people wanted her to appear suitable. She needed to be respectable. Her family wanted her reputation protected. Sexual reputation was particularly important for royal women. Questions about chastity and legitimacy mattered enormously. A child's legitimacy could determine inheritance. Therefore, a queen's sexual behavior was politically sensitive. The double standard was obvious. Kings could have mistresses. Queens faced much harsher scrutiny. Accusations of adultery could destroy a woman's reputation. They could also be used politically. If someone wanted to weaken a queen, accusing her of immoral behavior could be effective. Evidence was not always necessary. Rumors could spread, and once a rumor entered a chronicle, it could survive for centuries. This is why historians have to be careful with medieval accusations. A chronicler saying that a queen was unfaithful does not automatically make it true. It tells us that someone wanted the story told. That itself is useful information, but it is not proof. The medieval princess therefore lived under surveillance, not modern surveillance. There were no cameras, but there were people everywhere. Servants, ladies-in-waiting, clergy, visitors, nobles, messengers. Everyone noticed things, and court gossip could travel quickly. A queen's private life was rarely entirely private. Her pregnancy was public. Her clothing was public. Her religious behavior was public. Her relationships could become public. Even her grief could become political. If a king died, how did the queen respond? Did she show enough sorrow? Did she enter mourning? Did she remarry too quickly? Did she remain a widow? People noticed. The rules were not always written down, but everyone understood them. This made royal life exhausting. Imagine having every major motion interpreted as a political statement. Your husband dies. You grieve. Someone says you are too emotional. You recover. Someone says you did not grieve enough. You remarry. Someone says you are disloyal. You remain unmarried. Someone says you are wasting a political opportunity. You defend your children. Someone says you are ambitious. You stay silent. Someone says you are weak. There was almost no way to win. And yet some queens did remarkably well. They developed a public image carefully. They surrounded themselves with trusted people. They supported charitable institutions. They maintained religious reputations. They managed their households effectively, and they avoided unnecessary scandals. Not because they were perfect, but because they understood the value of perception. A queen's public image could protect her. It could also protect her children. If she was respected, her son could benefit. If she was hated, her enemies could use that against him. So reputation became part of dynastic politics. This brings us to one of the most interesting aspects of medieval royal women. Their children inherited their reputations. A queen's behavior could influence how her children were perceived, and a mother's political choices could shape her children's future. This is particularly visible with Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her sons had complicated relationships with her. Some saw her as an ally. Some depended on her. Some rebelled. But her political network remained useful. She could travel between courts. She could negotiate. She could act as an intermediary. Her experience gave her authority. She was living proof that a medieval woman could remain politically relevant long after her wedding day. And that is perhaps the biggest lesson of our entire story. The princess was not a single role. She moved through stages: daughter, bride, queen, mother, widow, regent, grandmother, patron, elder. Each stage brought different possibilities. Some women became more powerful as they aged. Others became less important. Some disappeared from the records. Some became famous. Some became saints. Some became villains. Some became footnotes. And some were remembered only because a document happened to survive. That randomness is part history. We know about certain women because someone wrote about them. We know about others because they signed a charter. We know about others because their tomb survives. And countless women disappeared from the record entirely. They lived, they married, they raised children, they managed households, they prayed, they aged, and then they died. No chronicler bothered to write about them. Their lives were no less real. They were simply less visible. So when we talk about the medieval princess, we are really talking about two things: the famous women and the enormous number of ordinary aristocratic women whose names barely survived. The princess in the fairy tale is easy to remember. The real woman is harder. She is found in fragments: a marriage contract, a letter, a land grant, a religious donation, a tomb, a genealogy, a passing sentence in a chronicle. And we have to piece her life together. Sometimes the result is surprisingly vivid. Sometimes there are gaps. And sometimes we simply have to say, we do not know. That is an important part of historical honesty. We do not need to invent details to make these women interesting. Their actual lives were already complicated enough. As the night grows quieter, imagine one final court. A young princess has just arrived. She is being introduced to everyone. She is nervous. She is trying to remember names. Someone is explaining the ceremony. Someone is adjusting her clothing. Someone is telling her where to stand. She looks around. The castle is beautiful. The people are polite. And she has no idea what her life will become. Maybe she will be remembered. Maybe she will not. Maybe she will become a queen everyone knows. Maybe she will simply disappear into the family tree. But she is about to begin the same journey that so many women before her experienced. She will marry. She will adapt. She will build a household. She may become a mother. She may become powerful. She may lose people she loves. She may become a widow. And eventually, she may grow old. The fairy tale promised that the princess would find happiness after the wedding. Medieval life promised nothing of the sort. But perhaps there is something more interesting than a fairy tale. There is survival. There is adaptation. There is the quiet ability to keep going. A princess did not need a magical ending. She needed to navigate reality. And some of these women did that extraordinarily well. So tonight, as the castle settles into darkness, let the labels disappear. No good queen, no bad queen, no saint, no villain, just people. Women who live inside a complicated world. Women who loved. Women who worried. Women who negotiated. Women who sometimes made mistakes. Women who sometimes succeeded. And women who, despite having little control over how their lives began, could still shape what happened next. Our journey is almost finished. There is one final part left. And in that final part, we will step back from individual queens and look at the whole strange journey. The princess who left home. The bride who entered another dynasty. The mother who raised heirs. The widow who sometimes found unexpected freedom. The queen whose reputation survived her. And the woman underneath all those titles. Because perhaps the most important thing to remember is this. She was never just a princess. She was a person. So let the castle grow quiet. Let the last candle burn. The queen has nothing more to prove tonight. She has lived long enough. Tomorrow, we will give her story its final resting place. And this time, we will finally reach the end. Sleep well. The royal court can wait until morning. Hey guys, tonight we reach the final quiet stretch of our journey. So dim the lights a little more. Let the room become still. And if you're already comfortable, simply stay there. There is nowhere else you need to be. For the last several evenings, we have followed the medieval princess through a life that sounded beautiful from a distance. Castles, crowns, silk, jewels, grand weddings, royal banquets, and handsome princes, at least according to whoever was writing the story. But when we moved closer, the picture became rather different. The castle had cold rooms. The wedding was usually a political agreement. The beautiful dress came with expectations. The crown came with responsibility. And the prince was sometimes simply a man with his own problems, ambitions, and unfortunate opinions. Of course he was. Tonight, we're going to step back and look at the whole journey. Not as a fairy tale, not as a tragedy, just as the complicated life of a woman who happened to be born into a world where her family tree could influence kingdoms. Our princess began as a daughter. That sounds simple, but being a royal daughter was already a political position. She was born into a family that needed alliances. Her birth mattered. Her gender mattered. Her order of birth mattered. Her future mattered. Before she could even understand what marriage meant, adults might already have been discussing it. Perhaps there was a neighboring kingdom that needed an alliance. Perhaps there was a powerful noble family that needed to be brought closer. Perhaps there was land involved. Perhaps there was a disputed inheritance. And somewhere in the middle of all these conversations was a little girl who was still learning how to read. That is one of the strangest things about medieval royal life. The adults were often planning 20 years ahead. The child was simply trying to get through Tuesday. She grew up. She learned religion. She learned manners. She learned household skills. Perhaps she learned several languages. Perhaps she developed an interest in books. Perhaps she enjoyed music. Perhaps she rode horses. Perhaps she was stubborn. Perhaps she was quiet. Perhaps she was cheerful. Perhaps she was rather difficult. The historical record rarely tells us these things. It is usually more interested in what she inherited, which is a shame, because behind every genealogy was a person. And people are always more complicated than genealogy makes them look. Eventually came the marriage. The wedding could be magnificent. The clothing could be expensive. The ceremony could be filled with religious symbolism. There could be gifts. There could be feasting. There could be music. Everyone could smile. And then the guests would leave. The princess would wake up the next morning. And suddenly she was expected to understand a completely different household. She might be in another country. She might not speak the local language well. Her husband might be almost a stranger. His mother might have strong opinions. His brothers might have ambitions. His nobles might be watching her. And the church would have its expectations too. She had entered a new dynasty. This was the point where the fairy tale usually ended, and real life began. Her first great responsibility was often motherhood. A royal marriage without children could become a political problem. The dynasty needed heirs. So pregnancy became part of politics. Childbirth became part of politics. Children became part of politics. Even the order in which children were born could matter. A first son could be extremely important. A second son could become a backup. A daughter could become a future diplomatic connection. And suddenly, the nursery was connected to the throne room. A baby was not simply a baby, not a baby could be the future king, or the future queen, or the future husband of another princess, or the future source of an inheritance dispute that historians would still be discussing centuries later. Because apparently medieval families were not satisfied with ordinary family drama. They needed castles attached to it. The queen raised her children, or supervised their upbringing. She watched them grow. She worried when they became sick. She arranged their education. She thought about their futures. And then, slowly, they began leaving. A daughter married. A son received lands. Another child entered a religious institution. Another went to another court. The family scattered. The queen remained at the center of a network stretching across kingdoms. Letters became important. Messengers came and went. News traveled slowly. A letter could take days or weeks. By the time it arrived, the situation might already have changed. A son might have become sick. A political alliance might have shifted. A marriage might have been proposed. A nobleman might have changed sides. The queen had to wait for information, and waiting was one of the great realities of medieval life. There was no instant message, no telephone, no quick conversation. If someone was far away, they were genuinely far away. The royal family could be connected by blood and separated by hundreds of miles, and yet those relationships mattered. A mother could influence a son from a distance. A sister could negotiate between brothers. A daughter could carry her mother's traditions into another kingdom. The medieval royal family was scattered, but it was also deeply connected, and women were often the threads holding that network together. Then came another stage. Age. The princess who had once been a young bride became a mother. The mother became a widow, and widowhood could change everything. If her husband died while her children were young, she might become regent. Suddenly, the woman who had once been expected to support a king was governing on behalf of a king. Blanche of Castile showed how powerful this position could become. Her son Louis IX was still a child when his father died. Blanche stepped forward. She protected his position. She managed political opposition. She governed. She negotiated. She raised a future king. And when Louis became an adult, her influence did not simply disappear. Her years of experience had made her valuable. This is one of the great contradictions of medieval womanhood. The system often treated women as dependent on men. Yet when a man died, a woman could suddenly become essential. A queen's power might grow because her husband was no longer there. She could inherit property. She could control her dower. She could maintain her own household. She could support her children. She could become a political intermediary. And sometimes, widowhood gave her something marriage had not: independence, not complete independence. The medieval world still had plenty of restrictions, but a widow with money, land, and adult children could have considerable room to act. Eleanor of Aquitaine is perhaps the clearest example. Her life was extraordinary even by royal standards. She was heiress to Aquitaine. She became Queen of France. Her first marriage ended. She became Queen of England. She had a large family. Her sons became major political figures. She experienced conflict with her husband. She spent years under restriction. And later, as an older woman, she remained politically active. Her life stretched across decades of European history. She saw kingdoms change. She saw children become rulers. She saw alliances form and disappear. And she remained part of the political landscape. That is not a fairy tale princess. That is something much more complicated and much more interesting, because the medieval princess was not necessarily powerless, but she was not necessarily free either. She existed somewhere between those two things. Her choices were limited, but within those limits, she could make decisions. She could choose how to manage her household. She could decide whom to trust. She could support a child. She could patronize a monastery. She could defend property. She could negotiate. She could write letters. She could influence a husband. She could shape the upbringing of her children. And sometimes she could become a ruler. The important thing is not to imagine her as secretly living a modern life. She was not. She did not have modern ideas about personal freedom. She lived inside medieval assumptions about gender, religion, family, and hierarchy. But people can work within a system without controlling the system. That is what many medieval women did. They adapted. They negotiated. They found openings. They used relationships. They relied on family. They used religion. They used property. They used reputation. They learned, and some became remarkably effective. There's another thing we should remember. Not every princess had a dramatic life. History tends to preserve unusual people. The famous queen, the rebellious princess, the woman who inherited a kingdom, the woman who became a saint, the woman who fought for her son's throne. These women are easier to write about. But thousands of aristocratic women lived much quieter lives. They married. They had children. They managed households. They supported churches. They exchanged letters. They grew old. They died. And then their names disappeared. That does not mean their lives were unimportant. It simply means history has terrible record keeping. A woman could spend 50 years caring for a household, managing property, raising children, and maintaining family connections. And if nobody wrote about her, she could disappear from the historical record. Her husband might receive several pages. Her name might receive one line. Perhaps a charter survives. Perhaps a tomb survives. Perhaps a marriage record. Sometimes only her name remains. And yet that name tells us something. She existed. She belonged to a family. She moved through the world. She had relationships. She had hopes. She had fears. She had ordinary days. And eventually, she became part of the past. That is why the fairy tale image can be misleading. The medieval princess was not simply waiting for a prince. She was living, sometimes badly, sometimes well, sometimes happily, sometimes miserably, often somewhere in between. She could be lonely inside a crowded palace. She could feel secure inside a marriage. She could feel trapped. She could feel powerful. She could experience all of these emotions during the same year, perhaps even during the same afternoon. Human beings are inconveniently complicated like that. And this brings us back to the idea of the fairy tale. Why do we still imagine medieval princesses as women in beautiful gowns waiting for romance? Because the image is simple. Real history is not. The fairy tale gives us a beginning, a princess, a problem, a prince, a wedding, a castle, and then happily ever after. Medieval life offered something else. A princess, a political agreement, a wedding, a new household, children, illness, letters, property disputes, religious obligations, family arguments, widowhood, inheritance, and eventually old age, not nearly as catchy, but much more human. And perhaps there is something comforting about that, because the medieval princess did not need everything to go perfectly. She simply had to keep going. And she did, one day at a time, one letter at a time, one child at a time, one political problem at a time. Sometimes she had help. Sometimes she did not. Sometimes she made good decisions. Sometimes she made terrible ones. Sometimes she trusted the wrong person. Sometimes she trusted herself. And sometimes, despite all the planning around her, life simply did something unexpected. That is the one thing no royal family could completely control. Life. A princess could be promised to a prince, but the prince could die. She could become queen, but her husband could die. She could have a son, but the son could die. She could build an alliance, but politics had changed. She could plan a marriage, but the agreement could collapse. The medieval world was full of plans, and reality had a habit of ignoring them. Perhaps that is why resilience mattered so much. The princess learned to adapt because there was no other choice. And maybe that is the closest thing to a universal lesson in her story. Not crowns, not castles, not dynasties. Adaptation. She began life with almost no control over the biggest decisions. Her parents chose her marriage. Her family chose her destination. Her dynasty chose her political purpose. But once she arrived, she still had to live. And living required choices. Small choices, daily choices, who to trust, how to respond, how to manage money, how to raise children, how to deal with relatives, how to protect herself, how to preserve her reputation, how to maintain relationships. These small decisions could become important over time, and sometimes that is where historical power really lives, not in dramatic moments, but in thousands of ordinary decisions. A letter written, a gift given, a marriage negotiated, a monastery supported, a child educated, a property defended, a relationship preserved. These things seem small, but history is made from small things. So let us return one final time to our imaginary princess. She is older now. The castle is quiet. Her children are grown. Her grandchildren are somewhere beyond the walls. The people who once surrounded her are mostly gone. The fashions have changed. The political world has changed. Perhaps even the dynasty has changed. But she remains. She sits beside the fire. Maybe she holds a small book. Maybe there's a ring on her hand. Maybe she has a letter from one of her children. She looks around the room. This place once frightened her. Now she knows every corridor, every doorway, every window. She remembers arriving as a young girl. She remembers the wedding. She remembers the first child. She remembers the sleepless nights. She remembers the arguments. She remembers the journeys. She remembers the people who disappeared from her life. She remembers the people who stayed. And perhaps, for the first time, she does not think about being a princess. She simply thinks about being herself. The titles have become less important. Princess, queen, mother, widow, regent, lady, all of them are names other people gave her. Underneath them was one woman, and she had lived. That is where we should probably leave her. Not on a throne, not in a grand wedding, not beside a handsome prince, but quietly, because after everything we have discussed, perhaps the most realistic ending is also the simplest. The palace becomes quiet. The servants leave. The fire burns low. The candles become smaller. The queen closes her eyes. Outside, the medieval world continues. Somewhere, another messenger is traveling. Somewhere, another marriage is being negotiated. Somewhere, another royal baby is being born. Somewhere, another young princess is being told that one day she will marry a prince. And she probably has absolutely no idea what that means yet. The cycle continues. Daughters become brides. Brides become queens. Queens become mothers. Mothers become widows. And some become powerful. Some become forgotten. Some become legends. Some become villains. Some become saints. And most simply become ancestors. Their descendants inherit their names, their lands, their stories, their memories, and sometimes, centuries later, someone opens a history book and discovers them again. A woman who lived 700 years ago. A woman who had a name, a family, a home, a complicated marriage, children she loved, people she disliked, things she feared, things she wanted, and an entire life that cannot be reduced to the word princess. So if there is one thing to remember from this long, sleepy journey, perhaps it is this. Being a medieval princess was not a fairy tale. It was a life, a very unusual life, a privileged life in many ways, a restricted life in others, a life surrounded by wealth, but also responsibility, a life filled with beautiful things, but rarely with complete freedom. And beneath all the crowns, contracts, castles, and political marriages, there was simply a human being trying to navigate the world she had been given. Sometimes she succeeded. Sometimes she failed. Sometimes she changed history. Sometimes history barely noticed her. But she lived, and perhaps that is enough. So now, let the castle become completely still. The last candle is almost gone. The corridors are empty. The royal household is asleep. There are no more letters tonight. No more marriage negotiations. No more inheritance disputes. No more family arguments. No one is asking the princess to produce an heir. No one is asking her to smile. No one is asking her to behave like a perfect queen. For once, she has no role to perform. She can simply rest. And perhaps, after a lifetime of being someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's queen, she can finally just be herself. So close your eyes. Let the medieval castle fade into the darkness. Let the sound of distant footsteps disappear. Let the candles go out. And somewhere very far away in the quiet past, let the princess finally have the one thing medieval royalty rarely had enough of. A peaceful night. Sleep well, and good night.